If you can. Okay, excellent. Well, first of all, I want to thank the organizers for putting together such an excellent conference. I don't know about you, but I'm completely exhausted. I'm just sad, though, that I wasn't here for all the workshops that led up to this, so I could have like 4 days of exhaustion instead of just one. So I'm also thrilled to be here because Cybernetics has a special place in my heart. So one of the first classes I took as an undergraduate in systems design engineering focused on this, the negative feedback loop. And the negative feedback loop, as Paul and Michael pointed out earlier this morning, is central to cybernetics, was central to Norbert Wiener's notion of control, to the comparison between man and machine, between command and communication that grounds cybernetics. Here's a little positive feedback as opposed to negative feedback. So it's amazing 30 years later. Okay, so how many of you were born after 1987? The shit you people have missed. That's all I have to say. Am I allowed to swear? Sorry. Okay, it's 6:30 people on a Saturday night. Okay. So it's amazing 30 years later to revisit feedback, control, and communication. And in particular, to revisit Wiener's assertion that the pattern is the message, right? So this was the big deal. We're not the stuff that abides, but rather the patterns that perpetuate themselves. A pattern is a message and may be transmitted as a message. Now, I want to take up the question of social cybernetics and alongside the many excellent observations and questions that you have all posed for us today. And here you just see 3 of the questions and observations from earlier today. And I want to think through these through the concept of proxies, patterns, and statistics. Now, before I dive in some context, today's talk is taken from a larger project called Discriminating Data, Individuals, Neighborhoods, and Proxies that explores the ways in which identity persists in the era of big data. So the ways in which categories such as race, gender, sexuality, and class persist and proliferate through and as proxies, through and as latent factors, through and as principal components. So in and through algorithms which are allegedly blind to them and which are made to blind us to them. Now we're told over and over again that we are living in the era of big data, right? That big data defines our present and the future. The Economist has declared that data is the new oil, the new resource to be exploited, although I like to think of it as the new coal. Okay, but why? Okay. Why is big data so big? Well, big data is allegedly so big because it relies on correlation rather than causality, right? And because of this, it opens up the world by showing us the relations that actually exist. Right? So for instance, Kukier and Meyer-Schonenberger have argued that by allowing us to address the entire data set, big data moves us from the why to the how, right? Theory is dead because causality is dead. And instead of causes, we have actual correlations. Actually existing correlations, proxies for certain behaviors that enable us to predict and possess the future. And that's the important thing, right? Knowledge now is allegedly possession of the future rather than possession of the past. And this is because, structurally speaking, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, the future and the past are structurally the same things in these models, right? The future and the past are missing but recreatable links, right? So consider this description of link prediction. What's key here is that the state T+1 is determined or retraced in the same way as missing information from the past. Now the problem, and this is something that Frank brought up in his really excellent presentation, is that almost any correlation can be shown to exist. Right? Multiple conflicting correlations are revealed all the time. So here's the infamous study that showed that obesity spreads like a virus among friends. So it recycled data used for the Framingham Heart Survey, and this survey was really key to figuring out a lot of the causes of heart disease in order to map out the spread of obesity. And it argued that your social neighborhood, rather than your geographical location or your family, most determine your likelihood of becoming obese. Now, it was attacked for several reasons, because clearly obesity isn't a virus. Ditching your friends when they start gaining weight isn't a way to tackle this problem, and as a Canadian, it's just not very nice to do. And also, because, and this is what this study showed, it conflated contagion with homophily. It conflated contagion with the tendency of people who are alike to act alike. Right? And also, it was attacked because it wasn't the only correlation that was found. So this study, for instance, found the opposite to be true, that your zip code and property value are actually the best predictor of your weight. Okay, so given this, given almost anything can be shown to be real, how do we know it's true? And how can we deal with the many conflicting correlations that we're faced with? Now, to make clear why this matters, consider these two fairly recent stories from ProPublica and BuzzFeed that documented Facebook and Google's inadvertent use of racist phrases to sell advertising. So Google suggested all sorts of racist advertising keywords to add to white people ruin, and Facebook enabled advertisers to reach people using anti-Semitic phrases drawn from the interests of people who were deemed to be, quote, like them. And every week, it seems, we're faced with another discovery about a discriminatory algorithm. So last year in August, a coalition of civil liberties and civil rights organizations issued a statement against predictive policing technologies. According to this group, the crime data that was embedded in these systems poisoned the result. What this led to was even more disproportionate and discriminatory policing practices. But this is just one of many, right? Others include, which I'm sure you've heard, a study by LaTanya Sweeney that showed that a Google search on a black-sounding name is 25% more likely to get an ad suggested of an arrest warrant. And revelations, and this is what Mimi pointed out in her really excellent presentation today as well, that software used by US courts to predict recidivism and thus used also to determine sentencing as well as parole by some courts is biased against racial minorities. So these programs, as Cathy O'Neill has documented in her book, become or have threatened to become weapons of mass destruction. Right? Or as Pinboard has put it, and I really like it, machine learning is like money laundering for bias. Okay, but if this is true, what can we do? How can we rectify the situation? Cathy O'Neill has argued for the need for transparency. We need to know the basis on which these algorithms run. We need to know the basis on which we're hired, fired, and sentenced. Right? As Kate Crawford and Jason Schultz have argued, the problem is that race and other protected categories are effectively, if not explicitly, factored into these algorithms. And how fantastic is it, by the way, that Kate Crawford now has that AI Now Institute in New York City? Yes, okay. So even programs that don't explicitly use race still effectively do through the proxies such as zip codes or neighborhood predictors. Right? So the most clear example of this is the Chicago police's heat list. Right? To combat the increasing homicide rate, the Chicago police created a heat list of the 400 people most likely to murder or be murdered. Right? The police then visited the folk highest on this list to warn them of their ways, right? Which made people think that they had just watched too much TV, right? Because this follows the plot of Person of Interest. Right? Now, to come up with this heat list, the Chicago police didn't use overtly racial categories, and they didn't just study people's actual behavior. They studied their social networks. So they placed people on this heat list not based solely on what they had done, not based solely on their personal history, but rather the actions and histories of their algorithmically determined network neighbors. Right? So because of their friends, they became persons of interest. And because of this, and this is what this points out, they became, as one person argued, he was more likely to be murdered because he was visited by the police, right? These people have clean records. The people on the list were also 2.88 times more likely to be arrested. It didn't bring down the crime rate, but it led to the people on that list being more likely to be arrested. And race didn't need to be factored in overtly because it was already factored in through a long history of segregation and discrimination. And it was also factored in because network neighborhoods presume segregation. We're segregated as users into clusters based on our similarities, right? Network connections are based on the notion of homophilia, the notion that similarity breeds connection. And because of this, as many researchers have pointed out, it's really easy to figure out our age and political affiliations via our user neighbors. And zip codes are used all the time as proxies for race. I love that machine, by the way. I love how it interrupts us with its little hum. What are you doing? What line will emerge? Sorry, okay. Now, a lot of the controversy has surrounded these algorithms on their use of race, right? As if the problem was with race rather than racism, right? So the belief is if we just got rid of ways of tracking race, racism would disappear. As though the problem was with the proxy rather than what the proxy is made to do, what it links to and what other factors it allegedly brings in. Now, to take on the really difficult question of proxies and their politics as well as patterns, I'm going to do something that seems really counterintuitive. I am going to take the question of racial profiling and place it next to the question of global climate change. Although as the talk goes on, this juxtaposition hopefully won't seem so strange. And this juxtaposition speaks to both the promise and the limitations of cybernetics. Because these analyses, in many ways, are similar. They use the same methods. They similarly seek to reconstruct both the past and the future. They similarly struggle with questions of authentication. And these similarities raise the really pressing questions: when and how do humans become as predictable as trees? Right? And I start with the question of global climate change models because they predict a plausible future. They reconstruct a past in order to change the future. Right? They offer us future states we don't want based on past interactions, so we will put into place a different, implausible future. Right? So they raise the question, what if we treated the results of these algorithms like global climate change models? As revealing what's wrong with past patterns and behaviors? What if we analyze them for the factors that lead to injustice, so that we move away from a disastrous present and future? What if we use these models, in other words, as critical tools to understand how racism persists even if, and especially when, we blind ourselves to race? They also raise the question, given the decades-long scientific consensus on global climate change, why has so little been done? What's the relationship between truth and action? And when and how can science, the pursuit of knowledge, become an alibi for inaction, right? George W. Bush funded global climate change research. And through that funding, that period of not knowing if it was true or not, he gave polluters time to keep going. And do we really need another model to uncover the racism that's hardly undercover? Right? Okay, so to be as concrete as possible, today, I guess it's tonight, I'll focus on the fate of one remarkable proxy, which is man's hockey stick. So part one, hockey sticks, how the past matters. Let me warn you, this is the longest section, so if we're still here and it's halfway through the talk, don't freak out. They get shorter as we go along. Okay. So we seem unequivocally to be experiencing the effects of global climate change, right? So 2006 set the record for average temperature, but you'll note that 9 out of the past 12 years have been the hottest on record. Given this, and the fact that, given this, the fact that there's any debate on the human impact on global climate change mystifies many, especially outside of the US. The US, of course, is at the center of global climate change denial, with Energy Secretary Rick Perry denying that humans have had the largest impact on climate change. And let me just note here, he claims the question isn't, is global climate change happening or not, but are humans responsible? And here he argues that the environment plays the biggest role. They're the primary control knobs, which effectively opens the door to geoengineering and the sort of bad cybernetics that Ken Wark was talking about so eloquently earlier. Now, the challenges of convincing people that global climate change exists are, or at least were, many. The primary one that's arguably been lost, is how does one convince people of something they can't easily experience? You don't easily experience climate or an average, is changing before it changes irrevocably in ways that we don't want. As Jim Hansen, noted NASA climate scientist, has pointed out, we experience weather, not climate. And changes in weather confuse our perspective on climate, right? So people experience a warm winter and then they say, oh, global climate change is a hoax. To visualize, to experience what we can't easily experience, folk have turned to proxies such as melting ice caps. And ice caps react to climate rather than weather. And these sort of proxies affectively register global climate change. They also increasingly turn to human experiences with weird weather. So Hansen et al. Argued in 2012 that if you want to convince people that global climate change is happening, what you have to point out is that the fact that we're experiencing more and more events that lie 3 standard deviations off the average, right? So weird weather, like intense hurricane action convinces people that global climate change is happening. People have also turned to graphs and other visualizations of temperature. And this hockey stick is the most iconic image of global climate change, not just because it's been used so frequently by politicians, it was used by the IPCC, for instance, but also because this is probably one of the most attacked scientific graphs as well. And it was attacked both by alleged scientists whose work was picked up by the Wall Street Journal and the MIT Technology Review, but also by politicians. So Mann's academic records were almost subpoenaed by a Republican lawmaker, and his emails were hacked and were the basis of ClimateGate. But why? Why is this image so controversial, especially given the fact that it makes no prediction about the future? It stops in 1999. So what's key is what isn't shown. The so-called medieval warming period from 1000 to 1400 AD in parts of Europe, China, Australia, and parts of North America. And the medieval warming period, which is also called the medieval climate anomaly, is key to deniers like Rick Perry, right? Key to the argument that natural factors play the biggest role in climate change. And Mann is a paleontologist, so he predicts or reconstructs the past, not the future. He engages in hindcasting. So to make sense of the present and future trends, what's important isn't simply forecasting, but also hindcasting. And hindcasting allows us to understand how the present differs from the past and why it differs as well. So this graph reveals the overwhelming impact of humans, right? If nothing has changed in this time period except the human use of hydrocarbons, the human use of hydrocarbons has to be responsible for the change in temperature. But hindcasting doesn't just reveal anomalies in the present and the future and the past, it's also used to verify and predict the future. Hindcasting is also used to verify these models. So these models are tested on their ability to predict past data. Past data that's either deliberately hidden from the model in the calibration phase or taken from a different data set. So again, structurally speaking, the past and the plausible future are structurally the same thing in these models, and this is the trap. Right? The future and the past are missing but recreatable links. Now, as I mentioned before, Mann was attacked for his use of proxies. And the hockey stick was produced using a network of proxies of various lengths and in different locations. And the key question for Mann was, how do we weigh these proxies so we have a fair fight between them? And given time, I can't go through their entire method, but I want to give you a rough sense of their procedure, because what was so controversial was their networked procedure, was their use of principal component analysis and SVD. So PCA, which was developed by Carl Pearson, noted eugenicist and father of modern statistics, seeks to resolve a set of possibly correlated observations into a set of linearly uncorrelated orthogonal principal components by determining the eigenvectors of the correlation matrix. So the first principal component will explain the most variability in the data, the second the next. The higher the eigenvalue, the more variability the associated eigenvector explains. And the point is to reduce matrices to eigenvalues and eigenvectors so you recenter the data around a series of orthogonal axes and the math becomes a lot simpler. To explain this, I'll focus on their 1998 hockey stick, which was published in Nature, and just focused on 1400 to 1998. So they used PCA in two ways. First, they used it to even out the data spatially. So again, given they were dealing with a lot of diverse sets of proxies, they had tree ring data, they had ice core data, but they had a lot of tree ring data, not of a lot of these other proxies. So in order to create a fair fight geographically, they used PCA. Right? Secondly, they used PCA to determine the few leading patterns of variation in the larger data set. So they decomposed, and this is the important part, the 20th century data into dominant patterns of variability. And they used this time period because they had the most data for it. All the proxies were present during this time period. They performed an eigenvector analysis of the correlation matrix to determine the principal components over time, as well as the spatial characteristics. So each eigenvector was resolved into a spatial component as well as a temporal principal component. And here you see the top 5 eigenvectors. And you'll notice that the first is the pattern of temperature increase. They then calibrated the proxies against the time histories of these patterns using SVD, and the fundamental assumption here is that each principal component is a linear combination of these proxies. And they use these calibrated proxies to predict the variations over the remaining time period. They then validated these predictions against actual data to measure their accuracy, hence the error bars that you see on this graph, and this is why it was included in the IPCC report. They also changed the number of proxies and eigenvectors used during the different time periods. Since all the proxies weren't available or pertinent, they didn't all resolve for the various time periods. And then they produced this hockey stick while also showing that the main principal component was the warming trend. Again, the attacks against man focused on his use of proxies. So Soon and Balunis attacked first, and they argued that multi-proxy networks are inherently inaccurate. You cannot use a networked procedure. Each proxy is like an individual voice. This article had many flaws, and half a dozen editors, including a scholar who is really critical of man, resigned from this journal in protest. Mann's analysis was also attacked, as the Wall Street Journal revealed, by businessman Stephen McIntyre and social scientist Ross McKittrick. We'll call those the bad Canadians, for what these authors alleged was the shoddy use of principal component analysis. Right? And they attacked Mann et al. For their use of a smaller calibration period. And they argued if you use the entire period, that you got a radically different result, that the warming trend moved from principal component 1 to principal component 4. They then just looked at the 2 top principal components that they got from their analysis, which means that the warming trend disappeared. And here you see Mann's response to their analysis. Intriguingly, Mann turns to eugenics to explain PCAs and the ways in which they can be distorted. So referring to the work of Stephen Jay Gould, he argues that McIntyre et al., by only using the first 2 PCAs, principal components, buried the signal of climate change, which is something that Spearman also did in his argument that race determines IQ. The link to eugenics, though, is far longer. Carl Pearson, again, was a eugenicist, and he developed correlation. How many of you have figured out a Pearson correlation coefficient? Right, exactly. He developed that as well as PCA in order to understand the impact of heredity on generations. So he developed PCA and correlation to reconstruct past means that haunted the present. And Pearson was a biometrician rather than a Mendelian. He considered Mendel to be theory and correlation to be theory-free. And there's a lot more to say about it, but here you just see 2 snippets from Pearson. And the resonances between Pearson's claims and the claims now being made about big data are really eerie, right? But rather than talk more about this, which I'm happy to do anytime, I want to switch gears a little and talk about social networking analysis. Because again, I want to consider global climate change models and proxies next to and against social networking analysis, because they share many of the same characteristics and methods. So part 2, correlating selves. So man's work to discover the patterns behind global climate change is eerily similar to other multi-proxy network reconstructions. Consider this study, which revealed how easy it is to reveal a person's age and gender based on publicly declared Facebook likes. So as Kaczynski et al. Revealed in this much-cited and highly influential 2013 PNAS article, it's really easy to determine, to authenticate a user's race, gender, and sexuality based on publicly available information. And in 2013, Facebook likes were public. They are now private. And they came up with predictions not only for physical traits such as race and gender, but also psychological traits. And this is because 58,000 Facebook users filled out those really stupid personality questionnaires, right? Which Kaczynski then correlated into various personality types. Now, if these categories look familiar and the name Kaczynski rings a bell, it's because he's become notorious for links between his research and Cambridge Analytica. Cambridge Analytica, of course, is accused of having influenced both Brexit and the 2016 US elections through psychological profiling based on Kaczynski's work. Cambridge Analytica, though, has denied this link, and the actual impact that Cambridge Analytica had on the election is still unclear. It's hard to determine. To produce these results, the researchers basically created a vast user-like matrix, which they then decomposed into the 100 most relevant components. And what you see here are the most correlated likes for IQ. Look at these closely. What do they assume? Right? How do these compress society? I like to view these as the MP3s of society, right? Now, what's key is that your actions matter not in isolation, but in relation to others. Data is most valuable, is most useful for prediction and identification only when it's authenticated with and against others who are deemed to be like you, right? So through your neighbors, people deemed to be like you because they like what you like and they hate what you hate, users are captured even when they're silent. So Kaczynski used an initial training set of users and likes to come up with this correlated matrix that was then used to predict the status of others. And this is clearer in their 2015 article where they lay out their method for matching personality types. So they used 90% of their data as a training set to build a linear regression model. They tested it against the remaining 10%, and they predicted your identity, your personality type, your latent class by weighing these manifest actions. Although these systems simply weighted already known factors and likes, eigenvector analysis and SVD is also used. SVD sounds kind of, anyway, we won't go there. It's also used to determine hidden or latent variables. I think there's a good resonance there, okay. So consider in this light Netflix. And somebody in the audience earlier, are you still here? Okay, it's 6:30, okay. So someone in this audience who left, pointed out that we know a lot about networks and network analysis because of the activity around the Netflix prize. So again, Netflix offered a large part of its database to the public and as well as a cash prize to anyone who could improve its recommendation system by 10%. Now, a lot of the teams used SVD to decompose the database. The goal was to identify the most important or manifest latent factors or classes. So each item or user, in other words, is considered to be a weighted sum of these vectors. And this was key to determining weak signals. And as this description makes clear, the move towards model-based systems, and importantly, model-based systems are a lot less intense computationally, especially in real time, raises the possibility of uncoverable causes, which can then be exploited. So Netflix is allegedly using these latent categories in order to determine its original programming. This is Netflix, but it's also behind the claims made by Cambridge Analytica and other groups, which brings me to part 3, authenticity and authentic futures. What's key to all of this, the key assumption to all of this, is a profound assumption of linearity. Again, a sense that the past and future are structurally similar unknowns. As Mann et al. Note, implicit in our approach are at least 3 fundamental assumptions. The first is that the indicators in our multi-proxy trainee network are linearly related to one or more of the instrumental training patterns. 2, that a relatively sparse but widely distributed sampling of long proxy and instrumental records may nonetheless sample most of the relatively small number of degrees of freedom in climate patterns. So a profound linearity in terms of space, right? Nothing is silent because it's adjacent to something else that's speaking. And thirdly, that patterns of variability captured by the multi-proxy network have analogs in the patterns we resolve in the shorter instrumental data. So again, profound assumptions about linearity in time. Again, these are profound assumptions of linearity. And what they raise, and what I can only point to in our remaining time together, is that applied to humans, they raise and implicate an entire history of training humans, of rendering humans predictable through massive amounts of data collection, as well as authentication. So what I'm going to do is just show you a short clip of the Cambridge Analytica video, the infamous video, to make this
clearly. Demographics and geographics and economics will influence your worldview. But equally important, or probably more important, are psychographics. That is an understanding of your personality, because it's personality that drives behavior, and behavior that obviously influences how you vote. So how is this possible? Well, at Cambridge, we've rolled out a long-form quantitative instrument to probe the underlying traits that inform personality. This is the cutting edge in experimental psychology known as the OCEAN model. OCEAN being an acronym for openness, how open you are to new experiences. Conscientiousness, whether you prefer order and habits and planning in your life. Extroversion, how social you are. Agreeableness, whether you put other people's needs and society and community ahead of yourself. And finally, neuroticism, a measurement of how much you tend to worry. By having hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Americans undertake this survey, we were able to form a model to predict the personality of every single adult in the United States of America. So how does this impact marketing and communications in elections? For a primary, the Second Amendment might be a popular issue amongst the electorate. If you know the personality of the people you're targeting, you can nuance your messaging to resonate more effectively with those key audience groups. So, for a highly neurotic and conscientious audience, you're going to need a message that is rational and fear-based or emotionally based. In this case, the threat of a burglary and the insurance policy of a gun is very persuasive. Conversely, for a closed and agreeable audience, these are people who care about tradition and habits and family and community. This could be the grandfather who taught his son to shoot and the father who will in turn teach his son. Obviously, talking about these values is going to be much more effective in communicating your message.
Okay, so they claim, Cambridge Analytica claims that it knows your personality even if you've never filled out their survey, because they've come up with proxies for these traits. So if you like Lady Gaga, you're an extrovert. If you like philosophy, you're an introvert. Okay. You'll note that although they claim not to use race, the face of conscientious neuroticism is that of a white female. And these ads are designed to accentuate fear. They're designed to place people in a highly affective condition, because when you're most agitated, you're most predictable, because you act in reaction to triggers. And what's important is you're put into a network neighborhood not based on the majority of your likes or dislikes, but the intensity of your likes and dislikes. So based on how you deviate from the norm most like others, right? Based, in other words, on what's considered to be our most authentic moments. And what I can only point to right now is the ways in which authenticity has become a way to train humans to behave slightly badly. Right? There's a profound reason why authenticity is now the buzzword amongst management circles and self-branders, why the 2016 elections were allegedly the authenticity elections. As Sarah Benet-Weiser has argued in her book, Authentic TM, authenticity is now a brand. Selves and corporations are carefully crafted to ensure authenticity. Right? And here's a message I was recently sent from Twitter. Right? So Twitter thinks I'm a really bad user because I have thousands of followers, but I don't tweet. So I was told to be myself. Don't be afraid to express myself. Don't be afraid, in other words, to deviate slightly from the norm, right? And the resurgence of authenticity in the 21st century, as many have noted, seems counterintuitive, right? So as Chandra Mukherjee has put it, American popular culture is obsessed with authenticity, yet awash in artificiality. Maybe. But what's key, and which I can only gesture towards in our few remaining minutes together, is that authenticity is not easily separated from artificiality. The most authentic politician in the US is also a reality TV star. Right? And reality TV is perhaps the most artificial, the most scripted form of TV there is. It's sold as format TV, right? But what's important to realize is that authenticity, and this is something that Lionel Trilling has argued, has always been linked to heroic dramas and to tragic heroes, to performances and demonstrations of intensities, to literary and performances, right? Authenticity has become so central because it's always been algorithmic. It's always been a set of rules or commands to be executed or followed, right? At the very simplest, to thine own self be true, or more simply, be yourself. Now, by calling authenticity algorithmic, I want to do more than highlight the methodological nature of authenticity. The term algorithmic authenticity reveals the ways in which users are validated and authenticated by network algorithms. The imperative be true to yourself, or more simply be true, makes our data valuable, that is recognizable across the many media platforms we use, right? So how many of you have used the same password across different platforms? Right. So your most unique moment, exactly, right? Okay. So fundamentally about recognition, who put up their hand, by the way? Sorry. Okay. So fundamentally about, did someone take a picture? Fundamentally about recognition. Algorithmic authenticity buttresses human and machinic pattern recognition. Algorithmic authenticity ties allegedly separate or even competing agents and platforms and programs together. Yes, but what algorithmic authenticity and the coupling of global climate change models and social networking analysis also reveals is that the future still remains uncertain. The future can never be reduced to a missing link. So think again of what these models seek to do. They seek to portray a future we don't want. They give us the next step, so we'll do something different. And it's in this light that we should revisit social networking models and their political consequences. Not to get caught up in this endless debate about what really affected X, Y, and Z, but rather to consider what factors have been put in place, what present are we living in that makes these futures plausible. Right? So what if we treated these models and results as pointing to underlying assumptions that we need to fight? What different, implausible future could we imagine, could we create together by simply questioning their defaults, which are called our defaults, as well as our habits? And what if we took inspiration from Cybernetics' call for action and grappled with the ways in which these networks create these patterns that they claim only to be describing? And how, though, can we think through that relationship between knowledge and action so we act rather than using knowledge as an alibi for inaction? Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. That was an incredible final keynote. I couldn't have asked for anything more. We're going to take a few questions for Wendy. If anyone has any, I'm sure you do. I'd love to hear from women. I've told Alex to lean towards that, so keep that in mind when you raise your hand.
It's 6:30 and there's a bar behind us. What, sorry, there's a question? Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Wendy. Great presentation. When you brought up the ocean model and it's funny because I have like some kind of app that shows the who does Facebook think you are? And it thinks that I'm like a middle-aged man. But I'm also not that active on Facebook, and I don't think that my activity on Facebook is a representative of who I consider myself to be. So I don't know, it creates an interesting dilemma. Should we strive somehow to create new data? Am I creating feedback? And who should that data go to, to create a more just interpretation of who this data says we are? Anyway.
No, that's a really great question. And it points out the paradox you're put in when you're given that information, because they want you to self-correct. And in fact, they'll give you things that are slightly off, so you'll self-correct in a way that they'll be able to better correct in the future, right? So I think that the question of what we need is a really open one. So Hiro Sterl and I have been working on a book together with Florian Kramer on homophily. And Hiro's thing is like, let's just get rid of recommender systems. Why do we need them? What have they done? And I think that the question of what we want and how this is framed is really key. And we have to realize that we're often given noisy predictions precisely so we'll be in that position, which seems so contradictory, of wanting to self-correct to assert our proper identity, right? It's like when my sweetie says, oh, we're not going there, okay. He's in the room. He's usually not in the room. I get to say things about ecologists, but he's in the room. Okay. So any other questions?
Hey. Okay. So on the one hand, science is like totally corrupt, like built by monstrous people for monstrous reasons and has really scary applications. But on the other hand, there's a kind of optimism. Like we can build these models that make predictions that tell us what we should change and how we should avoid, like what we see on the screen now, right? For you personally, which side do you come down on? Where does the balance lie? Do you believe in this like predictive and redemptive potential in the scientific process? Or do you think that, because of ill intentions and complicated contingent history for scientists, that we're stuck and there's no way out of this like hell world of bad intentions and broken tools?
Right. Okay. First of all, I would push back on this science is evil, doo-doo evil scientists versus science can be good. Because first of all, I think that one thing we need to do is refuse the narrative that science is bad somehow because of the intentions of scientists, right? This is why global climate change scientists are given death threats, right? The right is saying like these people are evil, they're both Marxists and they're greedy people who want $1 million grants, right? Yeah. And so let's target these people and just take them off the face of the earth, right? No. And I think that one thing we have to be careful about is falling into that intentionality, right? And I think what's really important is to also reject the notion that there's a positive or a negative just based on how we simply do things, but ask ourselves, why is this even constructed this way, right? And how can we productively move forward to think through what these models can and can't do? And I think that what we need is a lot of respect for a whole lot of disciplines. And to ask ourselves, okay, this is a large question we all care about. We can't answer it from one discipline. We need everybody here in the room to work on it together. And that's how I think you get the kind of interdisciplinary coalition that we need to take on these assumptions. I mean, humanists are scary people. Have you spent a time with a room of humanists? Oh, wait. Clearly, this is getting late, and hopefully the live feed has died. But I think there's a question. Sorry, another question? Sorry.
Hi. I'm kind of thinking about the phrase that you said, which was performances and demonstrations of intensities. And I'm thinking about kind of people's emotional reactions to things on both sides. And if you could talk a little bit about kind of psychology and how our like search for adrenaline or cortisol or these kinds of emotional things come into this type of data and how it's used.
Right, so there's a lot of work that's being done around that, and especially I would point to work that's being done around affect theory, because that's really key, because the fundamental presumption of linearity, X causes Y, that's a trigger mechanism. And what's being targeted are triggers that make X and Y happen. And so what a bunch of us have been thinking about is trying to rethink the basics of network connection and network neighborhoods. Why should people be clustered according to their intense likes and dislikes, right? Given the fact that the majority of our likes and dislikes probably coincide, right? What if we used mutual indifference as the basis for connection? This is how a city like New York City runs, right? We're all mutually indifferent and it makes it work, right? Or even like, how many of you know people who are heterosexual? Right? You know, there is a stream of thought that thinks that opposites attract, you know, or we can think of electromagnetic forces, you know, you go positive, negative. So I think that what's key is trying to rethink the bases for the connection that are used in these models as well. So not like certain things are bad or good, but rather moving away from this simple trigger mechanism in order to understand and deal with the complexity of human interactions. So we can have a different kind of society.
Thank you so much, Wendy. Thank you. We have one